I would like to present you our next lecturer, Jeremy Smith from the University of Eastern Finland, which before has a history of Russian history and politics, as a professor of Russian history and politics. You worked on non-Russian minorities in the USSR, right? Culminating your book, Red Nations, the Nationalities Experience in and After the USSR, which came out in 2012. And your work afterwards has been most focused on the relations of post-Soviet countries among themselves and border contacts between different ethnic groups, among other things, right? So, we're very looking forward to hear your experience in how to deal with ethnicity, class, and clan politics in Central Asia. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have a lecture in two parts. But both parts coming under the title Ethnicity, Class and Clan Politics. In some ways it's a quite surprising title. It's not surprising to me because it's my title. But when we think about these issues, certainly in terms of academics and research, ethnicity, clans and class, this is the realm of anthropologists, of sociologists, of historians maybe. So what are they doing being paired with politics in this way? And I think in the second part of the lecture it'll perhaps become a bit clearer, but I want to make one initial remark that in Central Asia and generally in the post-Soviet context, so in Russia as well, and certainly some of the other countries of that region, politics is everywhere. It's not a separate sphere. Now by that I don't mean that in the sense that Karl Marx would have meant it, that politics is everywhere because everything is about class struggle and politics is all about class struggle. But what I mean quite literally that there is not a separate sphere of politicians even who you can identify that you become a professional politician and this is your career path. And all you do is run in elections and try and climb up that political ladder. The national interest, politicians are very, very closely and much more openly than would be the case in Western Europe, for example, linked to specific interests and very often hold more than one position in society. So it's most obvious actually if you look at Russia. So the chairman of Gazprom, as it changes, whether it's Medvedev, they also have a political position. Also the CEOs of major companies, they're also in the government. So it's the same people running businesses and are involved in government. And this would be kind of, at least in where I come from, the UK and in Finland where I live now, this would be seen as a conflict of interest. This would be seen as something unusual. But it's not unusual, I think, in much of a post-Soviet context, including many of the countries of Central Asia. And in fact, as one leading analyst of Central Asia, I heard her say a few years ago, there's a kind of darker side to this. She said the problem in Kyrgyzstan is the close links between the politicians and the criminal gang leaders. The problem in Tajikistan is that the politicians and the criminal gang leaders are actually the same people. So that's one side of this as well, and this is of course all connected to drugs trafficking and transport, and this is one way that politics is characterized in Tajikistan, but it's very nakedly tied up with the drugs business and illegal activities. But for our purposes, that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about ethnicity, class, and clans. So the idea that clans and ethnicity in particular should be linked to politics. Again, this isn't totally unusual in a Western context, in a non-Central Asian context, but it's perhaps surprising how far discourse is about these links between these particular interests and the way politics is conducted at the national and, as I'll give some examples, the international level are conducted. So in the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about concepts. What do these things mean? In very broad terms, how do they characterize Central Asia? And I also want to caution here that it shouldn't be exaggerated. It's perhaps too easy to assign everything that goes on in Central Asia to not so much class, and I'll explain why we don't talk about class so much, but to ethnicity or to clans. It's not all about that. This is what I'm focusing on today, and it's certainly a very important part of politics, and the examples I'll give in the second part of the lecture I hope will illustrate that. So after giving these broad concepts in the first part, when we move on to the second part of the lecture, I'll be looking at some case studies, very briefly, of course, introducing some cases and thinking about how those relate to the broader questions of ethnicity, class and clans. So, I'm hoping that before the lecture, or perhaps when you saw the title, you might have thought a little bit, or you might have had, even without thinking about it, an immediate reaction. What do these terms mean? So a lot of what I'm doing in this first lecture is actually comparing different usages of these terms, including the usages that occur in the popular discourses and popular imagination. And so a lot of the images I'm putting up here are not that relevant to the Central Asian context necessarily. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but these are the kind of images that perhaps spring to our minds when we're confronted with a term or a concept like clan or ethnicity. Clan, I think, is not the most complex of these terms, but it's the most problematic in terms of having quite different meanings in quite different contexts, and sometimes some quite contradictory meanings. So I'm going to start with this category of clan and think about some of these meanings. So clans, the first meaning, of course, it's like a tribe, and again, I'm not going to go into differences between clans and tribes. I think an anthropologist would probably tell you there's an extremely important difference there, but for our purposes, and a lot of the literature, the contemporary literature actually uses the terms pretty much interchangeably, so I'm not going to get too much into the etymology or the precise definitions. But clans or tribes we think of as historic communities, large groups of people. The Scottish clans, of course, most famously of all. This is a fundamental form of organisation of society, as well as being represented by markers such as, in this case, in the case of Scotland, the kilts and so on, and very much organised around military affairs as well, but at the same time organising structures. So this is a kind of perhaps the first image of clans that comes into mind for most people from Western Europe, I would say. Worth bearing in mind, because we can apply similar lessons when we're thinking about clans in Central Asia, but in the Scottish context, one of the most famous articles about the Scottish clans was about the invention of tradition. It's a seminal article about how nations are built. So the Scottish clans, which are kind of, and the idea that there is a distinctive tartan belonging to each clan goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. Well, actually, this correlation was invented in the early 19th century by the novelist Walter Scott and other people. And this is a classic case of the invention of tradition and part of the invention of nations, which or the modernist account of nations, which I will come on to in a minute. So there's a lesson there, that these images we have of tribes, clans, as timeless, as going back into the mists of history, it's not necessarily there, even if they are presented like that. Nevertheless, there are a lot of societies where clans very much do form the bedrock of social organisation, as well as sometimes military organisation. Then the term clans, in other contexts, it can be used simply to talk about family ties. So you get talks about the Trump clan, just this, in this case, a very close family, a very direct nuclear family, if you like, but more often perhaps in terms of an extended family involving alliances made through marriage and cousins and so on. So there's this kind of, not a literal understanding of clans, not something historic, but might be a group of people who are influential, who support each other, and who are able to rely on each other because of their blood ties, because of kinship. And so this is another aspect of clanhood, and I will come back to how this might apply in the Central Asian context, but it's very important that the importance of family ties is not just that you like your relatives, but that there is a certain trust. There is a trust which does not exist with political allies. And so I think up here you have the Alievs, the only case in the post-Soviet context of a family, of a president's position being passed on from father to son, the only case so far, let's see. And there are other cases, of course, from other parts of the world, but there's very, very common, of course, in Central Asia for members of the president's family to hold important positions in government, or in business, or indeed in the military, in some other sphere, and for close family members to support each other and to back each other's interests. And so clan can be used to express that kind of organisation as well, and not just at the level of the president, but lower down as well in terms of regional governments and so on and so on. Then there's a more metaphorical use of the term clan, which kind of builds on that family concept, which is just to describe any kind of network of people, network of individuals who work for each other and back each other up. It's quite often been used in the Soviet context. My colleague Nikolai Mitrokhin has written about the clans at the very top of the Soviet power system. To describe, he uses the word clans to describe groups of individuals, quite extensive networks of individuals, but it doesn't embrace the whole of the Soviet leadership. It embraces parts of the Soviet leadership, and so it includes patronage and patron-client relations as well. But the point is that very informally, there are groups of people who back each other up on an individual basis. And this is another kind of use of clan. And finally, you have the clans of museums. This is kind of related, of course, to historic clans. So this is a museum exhibition supposed to show the hats of the different tribes of Kazakhstan. And putting a concept of clans into a museum, of course, is a way of celebrating national culture and national history. I would say it also quite often is a way of neutralizing certain kinds of identity. And you know, this is a practice which Stalin was good at as well. But by making ethnicity, by making nationality a kind of folklore, something to be celebrated in museums, it reduces its political importance. So in some circumstances, there are a number of different reasons why state authorities want to promote the idea of clans in museums. It does promote national culture and the kind of historic sense of a nation, but at the same time, it diffuses the potential that clans have. And of course, what is that potential, and why in some circumstances would leaders be fearful of clans? It's because they're a unit of mobilization. I think under all of these meanings, clans can be used to mobilize groups of people around specific demands or in support of specific individuals. So what we have in Central Asia, and I'll have to generalize because there are differences not only between each of the countries of Central Asia and each of the ethnic groups in Central Asia, but between different regions and so on. But I think overall we have some kind of combination of all four of these understandings of clans. So the main work that has been done about clans by Kathleen Collins emphasizes the kinship nature of clans, particularly in Kyrgyzstan. She's been looking at. So whether or not clans have existed for centuries and have fixed names, they are based on relatively close communities in a confined geographical area, and in particular are underpinned by family ties. So not just the one family, but clans can be expanded and allied and things through marriage, for example, and through spreading a clan between villages, for example, by intermarrying. And the clans are very important then as social organization, even in the post-Soviet context. So they take on some of the functions of criminal justice even. Clan leaders, clan elders can resolve disputes, and a lot of things operate outside the official legal system. And even in Kyrgyzstan, which was seen in the 1990s as the kind of model of society which was moving towards a Western-style democracy, but one of the problems that scholars have identified is that was preventing it moving towards a Western-style democracy was actually the persistence of local traditions of dealing with justice which undermined trust in the official justice system and left little role for it. And one way in which this kind of justice system was administered was through clans. So that's very often emphasized in terms of understandings of clan in Central Asia. But the historic clans with names, these are also emphasized as well. And of course, in any kind of circumstance, we can use the term clan metaphorically. It's just a group of people who are allied with each other without necessarily having any kind of formal sense of organization or historic basis for that alliance. But I don't think there's any one clear-cut definition or conception. It is a mixture of these different ideas of clan, and I will come back when I give the example in the second part of the lecture to why that can be problematic. Class is the category I'm going to say least about because it's the one perhaps you hear least about in discourse, and it's not because classes don't exist or aren't important in the Central Asian context, but class-based organization is relatively uncommon, and certainly the discourse of classes of, the rights of workers, for example, you don't hear so much as you do in, perhaps we're hearing less of it in post-industrial societies in the West anyway, but perhaps even less in Central Asia. I think there are a couple of reasons why it's difficult to think in class terms. One is the Soviet legacy, because the discourses of communism were discourses of class struggle. So as Ronald Sooney put it, the communist regime in the Soviet Union hijacked the whole discourse of class. And so class, the whole language of Marxism-Leninism, where everything was described in class, and it ultimately became meaningless. And so when it came to the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is one reason why, although there were independent trade union movements and so on, very often things fall back onto nationality and ethnicity, because the category of class as a potential one on which to organize a struggle or to base a new kind of regime or opposition to the communist regime, it's very difficult to do when that very regime has kind of monopolized the whole kind of language of class and represented itself as a regime based on the resolution of class struggle in favor of the proletariat. So this one reason it's been very difficult to talk about class struggle in any post-Soviet context, as well as the discrediting of Marxism and so on that is generally felt in the region. The other reason it's difficult in the Central Asian context, and I suppose particularly in relation to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, is the massive role played by migrant labour, because where do we fit this into classical discourses about class? How do we talk about migrant labourers who in some cases can become a kind of elite, the ones who go to Russia and get good jobs and send back good remittances to their home, and we know how much effect migrant labour and remittances has had on the economies in those two countries. How do we fit that into any kind of discussion of class? So it's not something you hear very much, and it becomes very difficult in certainly in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to make this kind of diagram. This is like 19th century Russia, but you could use this in a lot of societies to represent class structure. But it's quite difficult to do in the Central Asian context. And so it's less common for political parties and so on to be organised on the basis of class, at least to be overtly so. Doesn't mean, of course, that classes don't exist, that there aren't social divisions. There are, as there are in any society, and there are instances of particularly working class struggle, I would say. But they're also quite limited, or so far they have been quite limited and not been generalised, I think, partly because of the difficulty of making a general discourse about class in this kind of context. And now the most complex, perhaps, of these most complex concept, and the most important in the Central Asian context, and the one certainly we hear most about, is ethnicity or nationality. And this is the first question. Again, I'm not going to spend time talking about definitions. In some disciplines, it's very important to make this definition between ethnicity and nationality. Many people have tried different definitions, different distinctions, and so on. One way of, I think it's more about usage rather than an objective definition. So one difference you very often find in Soviet and post-Soviet studies, a distinction is that ethnicity is used for smaller groups. And in specifically, a nationality is a group which has its own territorial basis. So in the Soviet context, a republic. In the post-Soviet context, if you have a state which has its own nationality. But minorities, so ethnicity is used more for ethnic minorities. This is not a scientific distinction. I'm just saying that this is quite commonly used in the literature as one way of kind of distinguishing. But it means then, for example, that Uzbeks in Uzbekistan are a nationality, but in Kyrgyzstan they're an ethnicity. So it's not very logical either. And they capture much the same things, I think. So there have been lots of attempts to define nationality. I think for our purposes it's not so important. But I'm going to give you, well, to my mind, one of the earliest definitions of nationality. Still remains as good as anything else that I've seen since. This is John Stuart Mill writing in 1861. And he had a whole section on nationality. So it was quite early in terms of political thinkers thinking about nation and what it meant in terms of political philosophy. And he gives this definition: a portion of mankind may be said to constitute a nationality if they are united among themselves by common sympathies which do not exist between them and any others, which make them cooperate with each other more willingly than with other people, desire to be under the same government, and desire that it should be government by themselves or a portion of themselves exclusively. This feeling of nationality may have been generated by various causes. Sometimes it is the effect of identity of race and descent. Community of language and community of religion greatly contribute to it. Geographical limits are one of its causes. But the strongest of all is identity of political antecedents, the possession of a national history, and consequent community of recollections, collective pride and humiliation, pleasure and regret connected with the same incidents in the past. I think it's worth reading in full, because actually in that one paragraph it kind of encapsulates a lot of the contradictions about nationality, or all the different ways of conceiving nationality. He does go on to say that, okay, a nation doesn't have to have all of these characteristics at the same time, but you have, on the one hand, identity of race and descent, so this kind of almost biological view of nationality, but you also have, and what's I think quite surprising for the middle of the 19th century, is the kind of affective view of nationality, but it's common sympathies. It's actually a subjective view of nationality. It's as we'll come on to, the imagination that we have the same interests with each other within this particular group under the label of a particular nationality. In this context, I'm talking about nationality, but we could be talking about ethnicity as well. So actually, within that one definition, you get both kinds of you get both sides of what is the big debate amongst historians and other disciplines about what nations are. And this is the modernist versus primordial debate. So basically the different views of what a nation is, or where it comes from, what it's constituted based on. The primordial view is that this is something ancient, it's genetic, members of the same nation share the same characteristics and the same attitudes, in the same way that they share similar physical features, because they have the same DNA, and this kind of decides everything. So and therefore that kind of view of nationality, primordial, but with its roots going back to the mists of time, too far for us to discover, also implies that ethnic difference and potentially ethnic conflict is inevitable, because if you're genetically hardwired into a particular way of thinking and way of living, but and that only allows you to associate with other members of your own nationality, and it makes cooperation between, or coexistence between different nationalities very difficult in theory. So that's one consequence of the kind of primordial understanding of nationality. Now, the understanding which is much more common, I would say it's universal amongst scholars in Western Europe and North America and so on, is the modernist understanding of nationality. In other words, nations are actually not primeval, ancient categories. They are modern inventions, dating in most cases from the early 19th century onwards, and depending what part of the world you're in. There are disagreements between modernists about how far back you can trace nations and how important it is for nations to have actual older antecedents. But the point is anyway that these are constructs. Nations are constructs. They are things that are constructed around things like language, but also statehood, therefore territory, and so on. And they're constructed by modern states, which became then known as nation states, because in industrial societies in particular, governance and the organization of society, as well as foreign policy, becomes much easier to conduct if you're ruling over, or if your state and society consists of a group which is conceived of as homogeneous. And the whole point about nations is that they are conceived of as homogeneous to a greater or lesser extent. So this is the view which probably most of us share. Why bother about thinking about the primordial view of nationality, which seems self-evidently to be just wrong to people like me? Well, I might be wrong, but it's the popular view. It's what most people actually think. Most people do think their nation, most people have some attachment to their nation and think that that's because their nation can be traced back hundreds and thousands of years. And that it is the nation that defines them not only in terms of their language and where they might live, but it defines them in terms of other kind of characteristics. The other reason, so in popular understanding, primordialism is very much alive. Everywhere, I think, in the world. It also was the dominant understanding of our nationality in Soviet scholarship. And therefore, in this part of the world and in Russia and so on, this understanding of nationality persisted after the Soviet Union. I would say it's probably less dominant now than it was, but certainly I think talking about nationality in the 1990s with scholars from anywhere more or less in the former Soviet Union, they would understand it in these kind of primordial terms. So this is why it's important for us that it's very dominant still in the region, not just in popular understanding, but in, let's say elite or academic understandings, this primordial view of nations is important. So, I mean, there's a whole literature about these different understandings, but this is why I think it's important to, in our context, to think about that. And the other thing I want to say about nationality, and to link it or to think about how it's similar but in the same way not similar to the idea of clan, is through this notion of community. And the scholar Benedict Anderson, who has been very influential in nationality studies, coined this term imagined community, which I'll come back to, why I think that's particularly interesting and what's sometimes missed in discussions of Anderson's analysis. So, as I said, under at least quite a lot of the understandings of clan, they're limited to kinship ties, people who are related to each other and who live in a quite well-defined geographical area. This is the kind of classic case in Kyrgyzstan, for example. What that means is it's a real community in the sense that everyone can know each other. And this idea of a community which is small enough for everyone to know each other, this makes it extremely potent because it does mean that the clan elders, for example, the leaders of that particular society, they have real respect because they are known, and they are not only of their blood ties, but they are known personally to the people on whose behalf they are making decisions very often. Now, nations are too big for that. If you go back actually to some of the early thinkings about modern democracy, so the 18th century Enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he specified that democracy only works in communities where everyone knows each other. So you can only have a community of a couple of thousand people for democracy really to work. And so the point about imagined community, which I think is sometimes missed, is that this is an attempt to fill that gap. It's imagined in the sense that a nation is too big to be a community. And so you have to imagine that you know everyone in that community. You imagine you have some kind of ties with everybody in that nation. But what unites you, whether you think of it in terms of language or DNA or territory or so on, you have to imagine that this links you to everyone in that nation. And this is the point of, I think, of Benedict Anderson's analysis. And what underpins that is it's a false sense of community. It really is imagined. And because it's imagined, it's not a real community. A nation is something that can only exist in the head. So I'm talking about some very general concepts, but they do kind of relate to how nationality operates in the context of Central Asia and indeed anywhere else in the world. Getting a better image of this matter, so just to say a bit about nationality in the Central Asian context today, and why I made a point perhaps of that imagined community and the invention of nations and the modern nature of nations, is that when it comes to Central Asia, this is very clear. So a story about how nations came to exist in Central Asia, and when they came to exist, you know, we can be quite precise. For most of these people's national identity comes into being in 1926. Why 1926? Because two things happen. One is, or what's happening at the time, is the delimitation of Central Asia, the division of what was previously Turkmenistan and a bit of what had become known as Kyrgyzstan, but is very different from geographical Kyrgyzstan today. So in the what the Soviets did was to take this huge territory of what is now the 5 Central Asian states and divide it into republics. And I won't go into the details of that process because it actually takes quite a long time. It takes till the end of the 1930s before the final kind of configuration of republics is arrived at. But how does it happen? Or what happens at the same time? The other thing that happens in 1926 is the first all-Union Soviet census. So it's a census of the whole population of the Soviet Union. And these two events coinciding are extremely important in terms of the development of Central Asia later on. Because before that, these major nations that we identify today, in other words, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Turkmen, the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks, were not understood in the same way. Russians called all the Turkic peoples Tsars. There were references to Kyrgyz and Kara-Kyrgyz, but these didn't even quite overlap with the categories of Kyrgyz and Kazakhs as we understand it. So decision was made that what we need to have in Central Asia is a clear sense of nationality, national identity. Because if you went to a peasant in Central Asia and asked them, what is your identity, who are you? Number one answer, and we know this from the experiences of the census takers in 1926, number one answer is, I'm a Muslim. Number two answer is, I'm from this village or this town. Sometimes I'm a member of this clan, but that was actually relatively rare. So people didn't think of themselves, I'm an Uzbek, I'm a Kazakh, I'm a Turkmen. Not to the same extent that they would today. And it varied between nationalities. There were, these were not inventions, of course. They were not plucked out of the air. These national categories were based on language, because this was seen as the easiest way to identify who is different from each other. But alternatives were considered, by the way. This whole process was designed in advance by ethnographers working in Moscow, some of whom insisted that you could determined nationality by facial features, and they made lists of anthropomorphic features for the census takers to use when they were asking people about their nationality. Well, that was abandoned in the end, and language use became the default where it wasn't clear what the nationality of the individual was. So how it works then, and the Uzbek case is a classic one. The Uzbek nationality is based on a number of different Turkic dialects, so there was also the standardization of language as part of this process as well, into what was an urban dialect or out of many different dialects. And so this was used to define the Uzbek language, and then you had to define the Uzbek population. So the instructions that the census takers had was that you ask, of course there are a whole load of questions that the census takers were asking, but when it came to, one of them was, what is your nationality? They weren't allowed to record the answer if the answer was, I'm a Muslim, or I'm from this region or from this clan. So you have to question a bit more, what are you? So the first fallback position is it's self-defined. The respondent defines what is my nationality. But if they can't do that in a way which is acceptable, then the census taker has to determine it, and mostly they do this by language. So you have this process in 1926 where people are being assigned nationality or are being told this is what your nationality is, and moreover that this is a rather important category for you. By the way, one interesting thing, that in spite of their official lists of nationalities, Uyghurs were not on that list, but so many people insisted on, because identity was quite strong amongst at least a section of Uyghurs, and so many people insisted on calling themselves Uyghurs, that this was added as a category. So it was a kind of self-defined category which then became an official nationality category in the Soviet system, which was important. Now, why do these categories become important? Because in later politics, from this point onwards really, and it happens extremely rapidly, incredibly rapidly, when you think about it, that people hadn't been thinking of themselves previously as Uzbeks or Kyrgyz, they understand very quickly that these categories are important in terms of mobilizing resources, in terms of mobilizing support. And so the authorities in these newly created Soviet republics or regions also pay a lot of attention to this category and give preferential treatment to members of the titular nationality, as it is called. And as local communities and individuals understand this, they understand that they can mobilize their nationality in order to, in the right circles, to get preference in getting a job, for example, or to put forward demands for getting a local school in their region, because we need a school in this language, and you represent us on the basis of that nationality. So the adoption of national categories as a way of thinking and self-identifying is something new for the 1920s, for the most part. Amongst ordinary people. There are, of course, antecedents amongst intellectuals, Turkmen intellectuals, Kazakh intellectuals who had been pushing these ideas of nationality for a couple of decades. And these new categories of nationality very much built on the work of those people. But it was new for most people, but very, very quickly became central and became more and more important as the Soviet period got on. And so what nationality you belonged to mattered in terms of your prospects in jobs, in education, in land allocation, and this became one of the big contentious things later on. So that's part of a history of why nationality or ethnicity, because also in this process you get ethnic minorities being understood really for the first time. That, okay, I'm an Uzbek, but I'm living in a Kyrgyz territory. Yikes. And that really persists later on. I'm just going to finish off with this map which doesn't tell you a lot, partly because so much of it is white, because the population, it's either desert or it's just sparsely populated countryside. But 3 points to note from this map. Firstly, overall you don't get a feeling of this being a very, very mixed ethnic mosaic, which is a kind of term which you very often hear applied to Central Asia. But you do in this kind of area here. The area around Osh from Osh to the west, i.e. the Fergana Valley. So this is really where, and I mean actually it's more mixed than this map indicates. This area where you have Uzbeks and Tajiks and Kyrgyz and other nationalities as well living in individual villages alongside each other or separated from each other by short distances and very mixed up with each other. So it's one particular area of Central Asia where you really do have this ethnic mosaic, and as we'll see in the next lecture, that's where two of the biggest conflicts of the last 30 years have taken place. The second thing to point out, and this is quite obvious, I think, the big purple, the green, which is the Russians. So purple is Kazakhs, green is Russians, and so the large numbers of Russian population in northern Kazakhstan, and I'll come back to that again in the next lecture. And the last one, which is a much smaller one, I think it's also green, different shade of green, is the Karakalpaks in Uzbekistan, and this is, I think this is the only region that obtains an autonomous status based on nationality in post-Soviet Central Asia. And in any case, it's the one example I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. But if you're able to read the figures here, you also see that they're very small, 2.1% of the overall population. The Karakalpaks, so it's a very small number of people. They're not even a majority in their own republic, but nevertheless they have this quite unusual status for today of autonomous republic in a Central Asian country. So what I'm going to do in the second lecture, or the second part of this lecture, is go through some case studies and give you some actual material to think about how these concepts actually work in the Central Asian context since 1990. Thank you.